Hello and welcome, dear viewers and participants, to our 9th virtual seminar on applied economics and policy analysis in Central Asia. I'm your moderator, Bahram Kasimov from Westminster International University in Tashkent. Today we are very privileged to have two distinguished speakers. The first one is Hiroyuki Takeshima. Dr. Hiroyuki Takeshima works at International Food Policy Research Institute. He joined the IFPRI Washington office in 2012. His research focuses on agriculture technology adoption, including varietal technologies and mechanization, farm, non-farm linkages, agriculture transformation, and rural economic transformation. So his research covers Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. So he's also the 2018 recipient of the Niels Westermark Award of the International Association of Agriculture Economics. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, USA. And Hiro will today speak about very interesting and timely topic on agriculture nutrition linkages at household level, findings from 2 recent studies in Tajikistan. So to provide his comments and discuss this topic further, we're very lucky to have Dr. Roman Mogilevsky with us today. Dr. Roman Mogilevsky, if you work in Central Asia, needs no introduction. But briefly, Dr. Roman Mogilevsky is Associate Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Central Asia in Bishkek. His research interests include public finance, macroeconomics, trade policy, labor markets in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. For more than 20 years, he's been working as an advisor to Central Asian governments on their economies and as a consultant for the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, the UN, and other international organizations. He extensively publishes on different topics related to the economic and social development of post-transition countries. So with that, I'll pass it over to Hiro. Over to you, Hiro.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me stop the video. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for participating in today's seminar. I would like to also thank Westminster International University for providing the opportunity for me to deliver today's presentation. I will present the highlight from 2 recent studies that myself and my colleagues, as well as co-workers from Tajik Academy of Agricultural Sciences, conducted on the issue of agricultural nutrition linkages in Tajikistan. In this presentation, I will briefly provide the background on nutritional issues in Tajikistan, and then discuss the conceptual framework by agricultural nutrition linkages. And I will go over papers one by one, first discussing briefly the methodologies and then results. And finally, I will conclude with key messages. Just to provide the background, as you know, the malnutrition in low-income countries, including Tajikistan, has been challenging issues, one of the important global development issues. To address malnutrition, there are several approaches. Medical approach has been one of the direct approach, but increasingly a food-based approach has been recognized. There are also nutrition-sensitive approach that can complement nutrition-specific approach. The agriculture nutrition linkage has been an important food-based nutrition-sensitive approach, and this linkage has been increasingly recognized as an important linkage to improve nutritional status around the world. However, knowledge gap, albeit growing, the knowledge has been accumulating, but the knowledge gap is still large, including in countries like Tajikistan. So we need richer sets of evidence for various aspects of agriculture and nutrition linkages. And there are a number of nutritional indicators, and here are just two of the examples, stunting and underweight. When you look at Tajikistan, you will see that Tajikistan has made remarkable progress over the last few decades, but compared to other Central Asian countries, you still see that the country is still lagging behind other Central Asian countries. So addressing the nutritional malnutrition challenge remains an utmost importance for countries like Tajikistan. To address the nutritional challenge, as I mentioned, there are various sectoral approaches, and different countries have used different sectors to increase nutrition investments. And this is taken from the Global Nutrition Report 2018. And the study looked at a number of countries and how, which sectors the nutrition investments mostly come from in each of these countries. And if you look closely at Tajikistan, you will notice that country has made a significant investment in terms of health and social protection. Sorry. But the nutrition investment from agriculture sector has been relatively small in Tajikistan, meaning that the role of agriculture has been underappreciated as a nutrition strategy in Tajikistan. So again, this suggests that more evidence on agriculture and nutrition linkage can be very informative for the country. The other reason for importance of agriculture for nutrition is that despite the growing dependence on import, much of the domestic supply of food comes from the domestic production. Even for wheat, about half of the domestic consumption still comes from the domestic production, and many other crops, maize, potato, vegetables, and animal sourced food are largely provided by the domestic sector. So the domestic agriculture production remains a significant source of nutrients in Tajikistan. To understand the agriculture and nutrition linkage, there are several analytical frameworks. This is taken from the recent book published by IFPRI. And as you can see, there are several elements within these linkages and chains, and it shows how complicated this agriculture and nutrition linkage is. It involves production, incomes, and the consumption, access, as well as linkage with health, and also women's empowerment, and maternal and children's own constraints. And on top of that, all of these are linked through economy-wide factors. But the challenge is that many of these linkages still need a lot of evidence to support. So ultimately, what the two studies that we did was to provide evidence for some of these sub-linkages within this mega linkage. The first linkage that we looked at was food production and individual nutrition outcomes. This is really the core question. Does household food production affect nutrition? And another aspect in the first paper is to look at market access and how does access to food market complement or substitute the linkage between food production and nutrition. And the third aspect we looked at in the first paper was the more like a feedback aspect. How does the nutritional benefits are perceived by the household and whether it affects the agriculture production practices by the household. And the second paper also looked at a series of linkages. One is how the cooking time complement agriculture nutrition linkage, and also what is the effect in intra-household equality of nutritional outcomes, as well as the effect of technical efficiency. So let me go straight into the first paper. This paper has been recently published in Agricultural Economics. This has been one of the papers that looked at the agriculture and nutrition linkages, and one of the first paper that provided evidence from Tajikistan in this issue. In this study, we used two data sets. The first data set was 2015 USAID Feed the Future Meatline Survey. This was the data collected by IFPRI and Zerkala, which is the survey firm in Tajikistan. These data were collected to assess the progress on food security related indicators in this FTF zone of influence where USAID had been conducting interventions. This data have sample size of about 2,000 households from 12 rayons, districts in Hatlan region of Tajikistan. And the data were collected from February through March 2015. And the second set of data used in this paper was 2007 Tajikistan Living Standard Survey. This is one of the living standard surveys that the World Bank has been collecting across, in many countries. And in Tajikistan, we used 2007, which was a little bit old, but had information on agriculture and some nutritional outcomes such as household dietary diversity and anthropometrics. And that was the latest such living standard survey that contained this information. And this living standard survey had a sample size that was about 4,860 for the whole Tajikistan and about 720 in the areas covered under the first data set. So we primarily focused on this 720 just to be comparable to the first data sets. But we also conducted a sensitivity analysis by incorporating all the data, all the samples from Tajikistan. The 2007 survey was conducted in September through November 2007. And this is the location of households in Hatlan province from showing the location of samples from two data sets. So you see that they do not completely overlap, but there is sufficient overlap that allowed us to sort of partly control for unobserved district fixed effects, which improved the consistency of our estimates. In the first paper, we took two empirical approaches. The first set of analysis basically looked at the associations between agricultural production practice and various nutritional indicators. Agricultural production practices included diversification, yield, production scale, and used two methodologies. One is the well-known propensity-score matching. Basically, we created a binary indicator of various agriculture production practices such as below or above, sample, medium. So for example, for highly diversified households, we assigned 1, and households with low diversification, we assigned 0. And then looked at their effects on various nutritional indicators. And this was complemented by instrumental variable regression, where we instrument agricultural production practices by extension visit and an agricultural capital of the household, and look at the effects on these agricultural production practice on household nutritional outcomes. The first paper also had another component which looked at the factors associated with unobserved benefits and cost. This is the part that corresponds to the feedback aspect of agricultural nutrition linkage that I described earlier, assessing how the perceived returns on nutrition actually induce households to adapt agricultural production practice. And I will not go into too much detail in the technical side, but if you are interested, please feel free to approach me anytime. Basically, on this second component of the first paper, uses a framework developed by Lee and Madala and others, and recently revisited by Eisenhower and Heckman's team. One of the feature of this method is that allow us to identify factors that affect unobserved benefits and costs of adapting particular agricultural production characteristics. And this has been important in the settings like Tajikistan, where the production is a lot of households are still subsistence households, and their returns and costs in agricultural production are not easily observable. Here are the outcomes of nutrition and agricultural production practices. Nutritional outcomes included dietary diversity and anthropometrics, both at the household and individual level, taken from different data sets. And agricultural production practice diversification is number of food groups produced. Yield is production value per cultivated area. Production scale is the total production value per capita. And these were controlled by various explanatory variables: household demographics, human capital, agroecological variables, wealth, sanitary and hygienic conditions, and access to markets. And access to markets, which was another component that I described earlier in the analytical framework, that the growing literature suggests that the agricultural nutrition linkage, its strength depends on households' access to food markets. So we constructed a variable that indicates that the proxies access to food markets. Specifically, we used distances to 6 different types of food market: state stores, private store, food market, bazaar, livestock market, restaurant, and cafe. And we obtained the principal component of these 6 variables and used it as the primary indicator of access to food market, where we also conducted sensitivity and robustness check. There are additional explanatory variables used for children and women's equation. For children, included demographics of each child, and prenatal environmental shocks, seasonality of birth, characteristics of a primary caregiver of the children. And for women's equation, we included demographics and human capital of the woman. And for the second component of the analysis, this feedback aspect of the analysis, there are two additional sets of variables. One is the factors that potentially affect the benefits of agriculture production practice, but not cost. And what are these? These are typically variables such as ownership of fridge, freezer, or a microwave oven. If you can imagine, these sets of assets will affect the returns, nutritional returns of agricultural produce of the household, but it does not necessarily affect the cost of production. And similarly, we had extension visit and agricultural capital. These are affecting actually the cost of agricultural production practice, but not the benefit of nutritional outcomes. So I will just go through quickly the key results one by one. The first set of results are the effects on dietary diversity. There are three outcomes: household dietary diversity score, and children's dietary diversity, whether children was achieving minimum acceptable diet or minimum acceptable dietary diversity. And we assess the effects of each of three agricultural production practice: diversification, yield, and scale. So for example, 0.652 suggests that increasing the count of food groups produced by one would lead to 0.65 increase in household dietary diversity score. And generally, agricultural production had positive effects on these outcomes, but particularly the effects were stronger where the market access is poor, and sometimes the effects were negative in areas with good access, possibly due to high opportunity cost. The second set of outcomes are effects on women of reproductive age, women's dietary diversity score, as well as body mass index, whether the body mass index is normal. And we looked at the effects and the similar effects of each of three agricultural production practice. Again, these household agricultural production generally had positive effects on these nutritional outcomes. And again, the effects were stronger for households where market access is poor relative to households in good access areas. The third outcomes are children's anthropometrics, height for age, absence of stunting, and weight for age. And again, agriculture production generally had positive effects, and these effects were particularly strong in poor access areas. We also looked at the effects on household income. And for income, the patterns were somewhat different. Where market access is poor, household food production had less effects on income, which is intuitive, meaning that where our market access is poor, agricultural nutrition linkage is more through subsistence consumption, whereas in good market access area, it operates more through income and food purchase. And this is the result for the second component of the feedback aspects. And I will not go into detail in this table, but I would, this is how the full result would look like. And I will focus more on a subset of these results. These are the key variables. So for example, education of household members. Higher education would raise the benefits of crop diversification on women's dietary diversity. showing that there are heterogeneity in returns, nutritional returns to agricultural production practice. Similarly, in a more remote area, the benefits of crop diversification and women's dietary diversity is greater. Also, higher food price also raise the returns of crop diversification on new women's dietary diversity. Similarly, extension agricultural capital actually reduce the cost of yield enhancement and the crop diversification. And lastly, but most importantly, the expected benefits in fact induce particular agricultural production practice of the household. So the key message of the first study was in Tajikistan, Hatlam province, agriculture has important linkage with household nutrition. In poor access areas, it operates through direct consumption, while in good access areas, it's mostly through incomes. And our second component, the feedback aspect, showed that households recognize the net benefits on nutritional outcomes and adjust their farm production accordingly given the cost. However, the net benefits also vary across households. So improving access to extension agriculture equipment important for nutrition sensitive agriculture among smallholders. And as market access improves over time, nutritional outcomes depend increasingly on incomes from non-farm sector, and agriculture nutrition linkage at the household level tend to weaken, but doing so will take time. So in the short to medium term, it is important to directly support agriculture production by households in remote, poor access areas. So let me go straight to second paper. This paper was completed later than the first paper, and it's still at discussion paper stage, but I will appreciate any feedback from the audience. Just going back to the analytical framework, just to refresh your mind, this second paper looked at another subset of these linkages, and these are not mutually closely related to each other, but collectively providing evidence on these still enhance our understanding of this agricultural nutrition linkage. And we focused on these aspects because of the data availability. And just going through the literature, agriculture and nutrition linkage in Tajikistan, the first paper and others show that there are significant linkage at the household level. And there are other related literature, intra-household variations, especially among women, are also important aspect. And there are a number of literatures explaining what causes the variations among women within the household. But a few studies have looked at how household production actually affect this intra-household variation. So this study contributes to that. There's also separate literature on time allocations for cooking and childcare. Again, the importance of time allocation has been recognized, but the few studies have looked at how household food production and time allocation can complement each other. And lastly, productivity and technical efficiency, whether raising agricultural productivity and efficiency improve nutrition. Again, there is little evidence. So our study tried to fill all of these knowledge gaps. The second study uses similar data. The first set of data is the same data that we used in the first paper, 2015 study. And this study, as I mentioned, has 2,000 households and also includes about 3,500 women of reproductive age. So you can see that for some households, there are more than one observations of these women, which allowed us to also look at intra-household variation. And we also complemented this with the second set of data, which was 2018 August survey, which was conducted in similar regions, but with slightly different focus, but nonetheless used common instruments for various questions. This data have 1,200 households and about 2,000 women of reproductive age. And the empirical methods in this paper were somewhat complicated, but nonetheless it was empirically possible. Basically, we wanted to look at the complementarity between agriculture production and time use, cooking time, since both of them are endogenous to nutritional outcomes, but there are usually no very good instrumental variables for, especially for time use. So we took a different approach, and the methodology we used was what was called nested inverse probability weighting, combined with various propensity score based estimations. And growing literature suggests that this methodologies can provide some consistent estimates based on some assumptions. And this is just a snapshot of the two data sets, especially focusing on dietary diversity of women, 2015 and 2018 sample. This is based on 24-hour recall, 10 food groups, and in households with multiple respondents, we found that women's dietary diversity score actually differ among women in 45% of households. So meaning that in close to half of the households, different women had a different dietary diversity score, suggesting the intra-household variation among women. And these intra-household variations accounted for 20 to 30% of all variations. And this is the time use variable. This is based on 24-hour recall administered to primary respondent of the household. Typically, the respondent spent about 2 hours during the previous 24 hours on cooking activities, but there are also substantial variations across the households, which allowed us to look at their effects on nutritional outcomes. So here are the first set of results. The first set of results, basically the household food production was found to be more complementary to cooking time for the nutrition, especially for households in a rural area and households with lower cooking capital. For example, one standard deviation lower cooking capital value would mean 0.3 standard deviation higher complementarity of household production diversity and cooking time on women's dietary diversity score. And you notice that the black chart is statistically significant values, and in a rural area and households with lower cooking capital, you often find statistically significant positive effects, while in more urban area or households with higher cooking capital, the effects are much weaker. And this holds for both on-farm production diversity and agriculture production scale. meaning that for rural poor households with simple, less modern cooking equipment, household food production and investment in cooking time are important tools for nutritional improvement for women and children. And we looked at how these two factors also affect the inequality of nutritional outcomes within the household. Here we are looking at the negative, meaning that inequality is reduced. And here, again, the effects are somewhat weaker, but again, for rural households and households with lower cooking capital, generally, the agricultural food production and cooking time do not increase the intra-household inequality in these nutritional outcomes. But for households in an urban area or households with higher cooking capital, we sometimes see that some of the nutritional indicators we see actually increase in inequality, intra-household inequality. And thirdly, we looked at the agricultural technical efficiency and their effects on the complementarity with cooking capital. And again, we found that the effects are more positive and stronger for households that are in rural area and households with low cooking capital. Therefore, the key message from the second paper is that first, households' own production remains important because of cash constraints and limited access to food market. We also found that the diversity and quantity of food produced are both important. Diversity raises overall dietary diversity, while quantity produced reduces intra-household inequality and dietary diversity. Also, we found that nutrition-sensitive time allocation, in this case cooking time, is more effective when raw food items are diverse and abundant. Also, we found that raising technical efficiency of farm production further strengthens these linkages. And our study provides direct evidence for these hypotheses. Therefore, in the short to medium terms, promoting a nutrition-sensitive time allocation, such as investment in cooking time, should combine improved household food production. And crop diversification, such as home garden, should also achieve a certain scale. Diversity is important, but also achieving scale is important. And public investments for technical efficiency improvements are also important. So to conclude the findings from two studies, a food-based approach is equally important for nutrition as a medical approach. And this is especially so where infrastructure for supervision of supplementation and fortification, meaning infrastructure for medical approach, is limited. When in such instances, food-based approach is an important complement or substitution for medical approach for addressing nutritional issue. Nutrition-sensitive approach is equally important as nutrition-specific approach. And agriculture production at the household level is an important food-based nutrition-sensitive approach in itself. But it is also an important catalyst for other food-based nutrition-sensitive approach, including cooking time investment. But more evidence continues to be needed in different settings and can be attained through the empirical methods used in our study. And this is some key references taken from the two studies. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Hiro, for very interesting. I know everything went pretty fast because of our time restriction, but I would like to remind our viewers that you can use the Q&A function to drop your questions while we listen to our discussant, Raman Mogilevsky. Raman, over to you.
Many thanks. Many thanks to Dr. Takeshima for this very interesting presentation and based on two really deep and insightful papers. I would like to first of all stress that while these papers are based on empirical material from Tajikistan, they are very much relevant for other countries of Central Asia, and as a matter of fact, we are doing now studies, somewhat close studies on Kyrgyzstan. We just published a paper on stunting reduction in Kyrgyzstan, which is stunting is one of the key nutrition indicators of the status in the country. And secondly, we are doing now a study on linkages between food systems and non-communicable diseases, also in Kyrgyzstan. And some of our findings are very kind of well tuned to what I just heard during this presentation. So I think it will be very interesting to compare later on in detailed manner. For me, one of the important findings of the first paper is that how much market access affects the agricultural practices and the entire orientation of the production process. So if you have good market access, you think about income and you produce not necessarily what you eat. And that's exactly what we observe in Kyrgyzstan. And probably this is also should be relevant for some other countries of the region. Colleagues from Uzbekistan may comment on that. Which means that there is real trade-off between diet diversity or economy of scale and efficiency considerations. So, well, if what you grow is what you eat, then you need to care yourself about growing sufficiently diverse diet. And as Tajik experience shows that people do understand that and do perform respectfully. But if you can buy something produced outside of your farm plot or your village or your country, then you just concentrate on cash crops. And that's what we observe in Kyrgyzstan, people massively switching from producing wheat to production of animal feed of different kind, for example, and some other technical crops like sugar beet. I have three questions which, well, basically it's questions perhaps for further research, but if there are any immediate answers, that would be great. First of all, we know that in Tajikistan, there is now ongoing change in the farm structures. For example, in 2007, majority of agricultural production was concentrated in large collective farms, still collective farms. But now they are doing very quick transition to one household farms, much smaller scale, and probably very much different production and nutrition patterns. If you have something to say on this change, that would be great. Secondly, there was a comment on access to infrastructure, which seems to be critical, right, so, for the market access. And why people have poor access very often, it is because the infrastructure is not there. And I agree that poor quality of infrastructure is one of the key aspects. I just would like to comment that the presentation refers to road lengths, which hasn't changed for many years, might not be the most relevant indicator, because we all know in Central Asia we inherited a lot of roads, but then many of them have degraded. And now most of the infrastructure development activities, and we all know that the activities on infrastructure development are massive in Tajikistan and also in other countries of the region. So you rehabilitate the road, you spend a fortune, and you still don't increase the road length because this road already existed. So there are very few completely new roads built. So, well, perhaps we need to use or think about some other indicators for quality of infrastructure and access to infrastructure. And finally, I had a very big question how inter-household inequality is measured in the second paper. After hearing the presentation, I understand that it's based on the difference in responses of women in the same household. But most probably these women are like mother and daughter, or mother-in-law and wife of the son, or similar type of. So you can expect difference in age. Well, then perhaps nutrition patterns may differ naturally, because, well, young women have different, may need to have different patterns that ladies in their 50s or 60s. So was this taken into account? That would be also very interesting to know. Well, but in general, I think that's a really valuable piece of evidence we got now in our hands. Thank you very much for the IFPRI team. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Magilevsky. So Hiro, you have a chance to, before I open up to the audience, to respond quickly to Roman's comments. Please, over. Oh, you're muted, Hiro.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Roman, for very thoughtful encouragement and very important comments and questions. Yeah. On first question, how the change in farm structure, what implications it might have on this finding. I think, yeah, I think it have implications in various different levels. I think the change in farm structure will probably also affect the comparative advantage in growing different set of crops. Some of them that were suitable for larger, large-scale production may become more difficult to produce under the when the production shifts more to a smallholder system, and in contrast, production that are more suitable for small scale might become more have be more competitive advantage. But also the since smallholders tend to have tend to lack modern technologies and economies of scale, their constraints on access to inputs and equipment might become more binding factors for domestic production. And so I think, yeah, I think the government, it will be very important for the government to pay more attention to smallholders' constraints and provide the necessary support. On access, again, yes, this is also, yes, important point. Quality of infrastructure is, yeah, it's clearly important. Building roads in one of the challenge is to also the difference between a major trunk road versus more like a rural feeder road that lead to development of secondary towns, which have different implications on food market access, and also access to other types of public service such as health and sanitary, hygienic, services. Those have important factors that will come into equation of agriculture, nutrition linkages, and so yes, I totally agree that, yeah, taking into account those factors will remain very important in the future study. And the third point on intra-household equality, yes, yeah, you are absolutely correct that a lot of the variations will also accrue from variations in the individual characteristics. So yes, yeah, we included a number of variables to try to control for those factors as much as possible. We included like how how variable the ages are within this household, age of each member and educational level. So we constructed several inequality measurements for those basic characteristics of household members. And so hopefully those probably took care of some of the additional sources of intra-household inequality, and we still found that sometimes household production actually reduce the intra-household inequality, especially in rural areas and households with lower cooking capital. So so that's how we partly address this issue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So Hiro, one question is on your cooking time. From your time use data, I'm quite surprised to see that it's only less than 2 hours spent on cooking within the 24 hours, because I would assume that women in Central Asia, if they even cook for lunch and dinner, that takes more than 2 hours with preparation, probably three to 4 hours. So I'm not sure why it's only on the lower side. That's one comment. And the second result, I was quite curious to see the poor households with simple cooking equipment. And that so cooking time, investing in cooking time are more important tools for nutritional improvement of women and children. So the question is here, so should households invest in more cooking? If they cooking takes time, that means less time for other work opportunities, especially for the woman engaged in the cooking. So from one side, they're cooking, perhaps it's more nutritious. On the other hand, it's taking away time from other earning opportunities. So how do you balance the two?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much, Bakram. Yes, clearly, I think, yes, the issue you raised on cooking time is the issue of measurement error. And so this is sort of an indicator of how overall variation in cooking time across households. So it probably may not, capture, and it also depends on how cooking time is really defined. Sometimes household members engaged in multiple tasks. Some mothers, they cook and also take care of the babies at the same time, and so those are factors that affect the measurement error in this variables. So that was another reason we try to use, we paid more attention to the potential endogeneity of this variable, and used the propensity score based methods to somewhat mitigate the effects of on this on this variable. So to answer your question, honestly, I cannot really say whether 2 hours is underestimate or accurate, and that's a very important question, and it also relates to, there is actually a long literature on how time allocation should be measured, which is, thank you for raising that point, which I didn't spend time discussing, but that leads to another important question. What we did was to since still there also needs to be a more evidence on how the variations in cooking time still affects the nutritional outcomes, and how, more importantly, how does it depend on the household food production. And but overall, yes, it's still an open question and is very important. And the second point on, yes, the cooking equipment or cooking time. So this finding also relates to more on some literature focus on the importance of investing more in cooking preparation, and their positive effects on nutritional outcomes. If you cook more carefully, it tends to preserve more nutrients of the food that is cooked. But there's the focus has been more on the focus of this study was to look more at how this relates to the agricultural nutrition linkage at the household level. And so the question on whether the household females should invest more in cooking time or other more productive activities, that is that is an important question on itself that needs to be studied in other contexts. But in our focus was more on suggesting that where investment in cooking is emphasized, then the complementarity with household food production should also be taken into account. So I hope you can see that that was our angle that we took.
Okay, now it's clear. The message. So thank you. So thank you. I think it's 5:30 Tashkent time, so we're out of time. And thank you to our speakers for being on time. So I would like to thank Hiro and Raman again, your time, our viewers, for joining us today. Next time, please join us to hear from Professor Charles Becker of Duke University with his topic on Kazakhstan. Should be very interesting. So please stay safe and healthy and away from crowds. So with that, thank you, and I'll send everything here to you, the questions that I couldn't ask from the audience by email. Okay, so thank you, and see you next Wednesday. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.